When you spend enough years on the road, long-distance driving stops being a journey and becomes a rhythm. You learn the precise hum of the tires against wet asphalt, the dull orange glow of sodium streetlights, and the way thoughts drift when the rest of the world is asleep. Most of those midnight miles blur together into a quiet, forgotten haze. But there is one night, nearly 12 years ago, that remains as sharp as if it happened an hour ago. And no matter how many maps I check or how many years pass, the memory refuses to soften. I used to haul regional freight across the Pacific Northwest. It was honest, solitary work, and I enjoyed the quiet of the late-night shifts. It was late October, and a heavy, relentless rain had been falling since I left Seattle. The windshield wipers were keeping a steady, rhythmic beat against the glass, and the heater was blowing a dry, dusty, warm air into the cab. I was exhausted, the kind of heavy-eyed fatigue where your vision starts to narrow down to the white lines on the road. Around 2 in the morning, my GPS signal flickered and died. The screen went dark, leaving me on an unfamiliar detour road somewhere near the Oregon border. The trees pressed tight against both sides of the 2-lane highway, their branches bowing low under the weight of the downpour. I was looking for anywhere to pull over, just a patch of gravel to rest my eyes for 20 minutes. That was when the rain stopped. It didn't slow down, it didn't taper off into a drizzle. It stopped instantly, the way a light switch turns off a room. 1 second the rain was hammering against my roof, and the very next second, the air was bone dry. I looked out the side window. The sky above was clear and dark, filled with cold, sharp stars that hadn't been there a moment before. Just around the bend, a warm orange light spilled onto the pavement. A large neon sign glowed against the night sky, reading, "The Timberline Diner." It looked like something straight out of 1974. The parking lot was filled with polished, pristine vintage cars, Ford Gran Torinos, old Buicks, classic pickup trucks, all looking as though they had just rolled off the assembly line. There wasn't a speck of mud or water on any of them, despite the torrential storm I had been driving through moments earlier. I pulled my rig into the lot, desperately needing coffee. When I stepped out of the truck, the air hit me. It didn't smell like wet pine or autumn leaves. It smelled like cigarette smoke, vinyl, and fried onions, thick and suffocatingly warm. I pushed open the glass door of the diner. The bell above the door didn't ring. Inside, every booth was occupied. Dozens of people sat at the counter and in the vinyl seats. But the moment I walked in, the first thing I noticed was the absolute silence. There was no clinking of silverware, no jukebox playing, no low murmur of conversation. People were eating, moving their forks and knives with a strange, mechanical rhythm, eyes staring straight ahead at the blank walls. I sat down at a corner booth. The air inside felt heavy, almost pressurized, making it hard to breathe deeply. A waitress approached my table. She wore a yellow uniform with a white apron that looked crisp and unwashed. She laid down a plastic menu without looking at me. Her face was completely smooth, devoid of any lines, wrinkles, or emotion. When I looked into her eyes, there was no reflection, no spark of awareness. It felt less like looking at a person and more like looking at a mannequin painted to resemble one. I tried to speak, asking for a black coffee, but my voice sounded flat and muffled, as if the room itself was absorbing the sound waves before they could travel. She simply nodded, turned around with stiff, precise steps, and walked toward the kitchen. A cold, visceral dread began to coil in my stomach. I looked around the room again. The man in the booth next to me was cutting a piece of meat, putting it in his mouth, chewing 6 times and repeating the exact same motion over and over. Nobody looked at each other. Nobody blinked. It was a terrifying copy of human behavior, executed by things that didn't understand what human behavior actually felt like. My instincts, sharpened by years of trusting my gut on isolated roads, screamed at me to leave. I reached into my pocket to pull out some cash to leave on the table, just in case. Along with my dollar bills, my heavy titanium keychain. A custom piece, engraved with my initials and my daughter's birth date, slipped from my nervous fingers and fell into the gap between the vinyl booth seat and the wall. I reached down to grab it, but in my panic, I accidentally knocked it deeper into the dark floorboards beneath the booth frame. I didn't stay to retrieve it. I stood up, walked briskly out the door, and practically sprinted back to my truck. I slammed the door, turned the key, and backed out of the lot as fast as the engine would allow. The moment my rear tires crossed the boundary line of the parking lot, the rain hit my windshield like a tidal wave. The sky went pitch black again, torrents of water slamming against the metal frame. I looked in my side mirror to see the glowing orange sign of the diner. There was nothing there. No lights, no building, no parking lot. Just a dark, impenetrable wall of dense pine trees and wet grass bowing in the wind. I drove the rest of the night in total silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, unable to process what my eyes had seen. For years, I told no one. I checked state archives, old highway maps, and local historical databases. There had never been a diner on that stretch of road. No permits, no property records, nothing. I tried to convince myself that fatigue had played a cruel trick on my mind, that I had experienced a vivid waking dream brought on by exhaustion. Then, 3 months ago, I was scrolling through a regional metal detecting forum online. A local hobbyist had posted photos of historical artifacts he had dug up on an abandoned logging plot near the state border, the exact location where I had pulled off the road 12 years prior. He was asking for help identifying an unusual find. It was a photo of my titanium keychain. It was heavily scratched, but my initials and my daughter's birth date were clearly legible on the metal. According to the forum post, the detectorist had found it buried 4 feet underground, firmly embedded inside the thick petrified root system of a 50-year-old oak tree. I sat at my computer for hours, staring at that image. The world had corrected itself that night. It had erased the diner, the lights, and the lifeless people in the booths, returning the forest to what it was supposed to be. But it had missed one tiny detail. I don't drive late at night anymore, because every time I look out into the dark trees beside an empty highway, I wonder what else is standing right beside us, hidden behind a curtain that could slip open at any second. There's a quiet comfort in the mundane routines of an ordinary life. For over 8 years, I worked as a senior archivist for a civil engineering firm in downtown Ohio. It wasn't exciting work, but it was structured and predictable. My days were measured in the smell of old paper, the rhythmic hum of fluorescent lights, and the familiar faces of colleagues who had shared the same floor for almost a decade. My desk was located in a quiet corner of the 4th floor, right beside a large bay window overlooking the street. Directly across from me sat David Vance. David had been hired 3 weeks after I started. We weren't just co-workers, we were close friends. We knew everything about each other's lives. We spent our lunch breaks at the same corner deli, argued about football, and complained about management. I knew his wife's name, his dog's breed, and how he took his coffee 2 sugars, no milk. He was as real to me as the desk I sat at every single morning. On a rainy Monday in mid-November, I arrived at the office early as usual. I grabbed 2 coffees from the lobby cafe, walked up the stairs, and approached our corner alcove. David's desk was empty, but it wasn't just unoccupied, it looked wrong. The dual monitors he used were gone, replaced by a single outdated CRT screen covered in a thick layer of gray dust. The framed photo of his dog was gone. In fact, the surface of the desk was stacked high with rusted metal filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been touched in 20 years. I assumed he'd been moved to a different department over the weekend without my knowledge. I walked over to our department manager, Mr. Henderson, who was pouring himself a mug in the break room. I smiled and asked where they had relocated David. Henderson stopped pouring. He turned around slowly, looking at me with a faint, puzzled expression. He asked me who I was talking about. I laughed, thinking it was a Monday morning joke. I said, David Vance, my desk partner for 8 years. Henderson didn't laugh. His eyes narrowed in genuine concern. He told me that nobody named David Vance had ever worked for the firm. He said the desk had been used strictly as an overflow archive storage space since 2016. A cold, heavy knot formed in my chest. I told him he was being ridiculous. I described David in detail, his voice, his car, his desk setup. Henderson's expression shifted from confusion to a careful, cautious pity. He gently suggested that I might be burnt out or perhaps recovering from a bad flu. Panicking, I went to the digital HR database on my computer. I typed in David Vance. The system returned a 0 result error page. I went to our shared project folders. The files that David and I had spent 6 months finalizing were there, but every single digital signature, every edit log, and every comment previously marked with his name now had my name on it instead. I sat at my desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt like I was standing on ice that was thinning by the second. I opened my personal phone, looking for photos of us from company holiday parties. I found the photo from last year's Christmas dinner. I remembered standing next to David near the punch bowl while someone took the picture. When I opened the image file, I was standing alone near the wall, smiling awkwardly at empty space. The space beside me was just a blurry, blank background. The world had rewritten itself. It had scrubbed David from the digital logs, from the company records, and from the memories of every human being in that building. I sat there for 2 hours, unable to move, listening to the monotonous clicking of keyboards around me. The office felt cold, stripped of its warmth. It felt like moving through a stage set where the actors were reading lines from a script that had been quietly altered behind my back. Then I remembered the physical basement archives. Our firm still kept analog paper ledgers for historical building permits from the early 1980s. Because they were paper records stored in airtight metal boxes in the sub-basement, they were rarely accessed or synchronized with the main database. 3 months prior, David and I had spent 2 weeks down there manually auditing physical blueprints. I sprinted down the stairs to the sub-basement. The air down there was damp and smelled of concrete and old cardboard. I pulled open the heavy metal door, walked to row 14, and pulled down the thick leather-bound logbook for Project 804. I opened the cover. There, on the inside jacket, was a handwritten log of the archivists who had reviewed the box. Written in dark blue ink from a fountain pen was David's signature, alongside his employee badge number, dated just 12 weeks prior. David always used a vintage Parker pen with a custom broad nib that bled slightly into the paper grain. I stared at his handwriting. The ink was physical. It was real. The universe had managed to alter digital pixels, server drives, and human brain synapses in an instant, but it had overlooked a forgotten slip of paper locked inside a steel box beneath 3 feet of concrete. As I stood there holding the ledger, the overhead fluorescent light flickered violently. A low, vibrational hum vibrated through the floorboards, so deep I felt it in my teeth. For a split second, the air pressure dropped, making my ears pop. I looked back down at the paper. Right before my eyes, the blue ink of his signature began to lift from the fibers, dissolving like dark dye dropped into water, fading into nothingness until the line was completely blank. I closed the book, locked the storage cabinet, and walked upstairs. I resigned from the firm 2 weeks later. I live a quiet life now. I try not to form deep attachments to places or routines. Because I realized something terrifying that afternoon in the basement. Our reality isn't as solid as we like to believe. It is a fragile digital canvas that can be edited, patched, and rewritten at any moment. And somewhere out there, in the quiet gaps between memories, are the names of people who were erased overnight, leaving behind only the ghost of a feeling that someone vital is missing from the room. Living in the high country of the Appalachian foothills teaches you to appreciate silence. I bought my cabin back in 2008, far enough off the grid that the nearest paved road was a 20-minute drive through dense timber. My passion for over 30 years has been amateur shortwave radio. There is something profoundly peaceful about sitting in a dark room at 2 a.m., scanning through atmospheric static, tuning into signals originating from halfway across the globe. It was a cold, bitter Tuesday in mid-February. A thick layer of frost covered the cabin windows, and the wind was howling through the pines outside. I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by the warm green glow of my radio equipment. The vacuum tubes of my vintage receiver were emitting a gentle, comforting heat. At precisely 2:47 a.m., the steady hiss of white noise was suddenly shattered by a burst of harsh, high-frequency static. I adjusted the tuning dial, trying to lock onto the frequency. A voice came through. It was frantic, distorted by heavy interference, but undeniably human. It was a man's voice, screaming over a background roar of screeching metal and deafening wind. He was yelling into an open microphone. "Emergency broadcast, all units. Freight 809 has lost braking pressure on the steep grade approaching Miller's Gorge trestle. Engine fire in Unit 2. We are failing to retard speed. I have no brakes. We are going over. Underneath his voice, I could hear a terrifying cacophony of sound, the deafening metallic shriek of steel wheels grinding against rails, the roar of a massive engine tearing itself apart, and the distinct concussive boom of an explosion echoing through a canyon. The audio was so vivid, so violently physical, that the air in my small radio room felt suddenly cold and heavy, as if the atmospheric pressure had dropped precipitously. The transmission ended abruptly with a sickening crunch of tearing iron and a burst of dead static. My heart was hammering in my throat. Miller's Gorge Trestle was a massive historic steel rail bridge located just 14 miles north of my cabin. It spanned a 300-foot ravine over a rocky riverbed. Without hesitating, I grabbed my satellite phone and dialed the local county sheriff's department. I reported the distress signal, giving them the exact freight number, Freight 809, and the location mentioned in the broadcast. The dispatcher listened quietly, took down my information, and promised to send a patrol car to check the canyon access road. 20 minutes later, the dispatcher called me back. Her tone was careful, measured, and distinctly cold. She informed me that a deputy had just checked the Miller's Gorge access point. The tracks were clear. There was no smoke, no fire, and no train. Furthermore, she had contacted the Regional Rail Dispatch Center. Freight 809 was currently sitting safely at a rail yard 40 miles south, undergoing routine maintenance, and wasn't scheduled to move until the following evening. I apologized for the disturbance, feeling a sudden wave of embarrassment. I assumed I had intercepted a rogue signal, perhaps someone playing a sick prank on an unlisted frequency, or an old audio recording broadcast by another radio enthusiast. I shut down my rig, went to bed, and tried to forget the sound of the man's terrified voice. The next day passed quietly. Wednesday night arrived, bringing another cold, clear sky. At 2:40 a.m., exactly 24 hours after the strange transmission, a sudden, massive concussive boom shook my cabin walls. The glass windows rattled in their frames. A deep, low-frequency rumble vibrated through the floorboards, followed by a faint orange glow illuminating the northern horizon over the tree line. I threw on my heavy coat, jumped into my truck, and drove recklessly toward Miller's Gorge. When I reached the bridge access road, the scene was pure chaos. Emergency vehicles were already arriving, their red and blue lights flashing against the snow. Smoke, black, acrid, and thick with the smell of burning diesel, was billowing up from the bottom of the ravine. Freight 809 had suffered a catastrophic brake failure on the mountain descent. The lead locomotives had derailed at the entrance of the trestle, plunging 300 feet into the rocky gorge below. I stood at the edge of the overlook, frozen in shock. I listened to the radio chatter from the first responders' vehicles parked nearby. The words being spoken over the tactical channels were identical to the frantic recording I had heard the night before. The timeline, the train number, the nature of the mechanical failure, everything matched down to the smallest terrifying detail. I spent the next week in a state of quiet paralysis. I tried to convince myself that it was a bizarre coincidence, a strange premonition, or that I had somehow misheard the dates. I stopped answering my phone. I stopped turning on the radio. The world felt wrong, offset by a gear tooth, as if time itself had slipped out of alignment for a single night. Then, 6 days after the crash, I was cleaning off my radio workbench. My vintage setup includes an old, fully mechanical reel-to-reel magnetic tape recorder that I keep hardwired to the primary audio output. It features an analog mechanical clock stamp, a tiny metal wheel that physically indents the date and time directly onto the magnetic tape margin as it records. I had left the tape running on automatic voice activation the night of the first signal. I pulled the reel from the machine and held the tape up to a magnifying lamp. Stamped clearly onto the physical brown ribbon, pressed directly into the magnetic material by steel die pins, was the date and time stamp of the recording, February 17th at 2:47 a.m. The disaster at Miller's Gorge had occurred on February 18th at 2:47 a.m. I hold that physical spool of tape in my hand sometimes. The digital world can be altered, memories can fail, but a mechanical indentation on magnetic tape doesn't lie. I intercepted the death cry of a train 24 hours before it ever left the station. I still sit in my cabin at night, looking at the glowing green dials of my receiver. But I don't scan the frequencies anymore. I leave the radio turned off, because I realized that the universe occasionally leaks its horrors before they are supposed to happen. And I am terrified that if I turn that dial again, I might hear a broadcast detailing an emergency that hasn't happened yet. To me.